First class wasn't built for him. That was obvious the moment eyes cut sideways, voices dropped to mocking whispers, and the flight crew's smiles tightened into thin, polite threats. A black man in a tailored suit became a problem to manage before he even opened his mouth. They didn't see a paying customer. They saw someone who didn't belong. What they never suspected was that every insult, every sly code word, every smirk and dismissal was being carefully remembered by someone with the power to ruin them. This isn't the story of an argument on a plane. It's the unraveling of a lie told by people who thought their status made them untouchable. Watch closely. Before this flight is over, the ones doing the humiliating will beg for forgiveness. If you're ready for a story that hits hard and refuses to look away, like, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from. Let's see who's here for the truth. Darius Mitchell boarded the plane with the quiet confidence of someone who had paid extra to ensure his comfort. He wore a tailored charcoal suit with subtle pinstripes and a crisp white shirt open at the collar. No tie. He'd flown first class many times before, but always felt a flicker of tension before every flight, wondering if today would be the day he was treated as an equal or as an intruder. As he stepped into the first-class cabin, he nodded politely at other passengers, meeting the eyes of a man in his 50s who quickly looked away. Darius placed his leather carry-on in the overhead compartment with practiced ease and lowered himself into seat 2A. He exhaled slowly, mentally going over his plans for the trip ahead, a well-earned vacation in Maui after a brutal 6 months of corporate battles. But the small, deliberate slights began almost immediately. A flight attendant named Brad, in his mid-30s with short-cropped blonde hair and a forced grin, approached. "Good afternoon, sir," he said, voice tight. His eyes flicked from Darius's face to the boarding pass clutched in his hand. "Mind if I see your ticket again?" Darius raised an eyebrow, but handed over. "Sure." Brad scrutinized it for a few long seconds, as though Darius might have smuggled himself in under the cover of first-class luxury. Finally, he handed it back. "All right, thank you." He didn't say, "Enjoy your flight," or "Can I get you anything?" Just turned and walked off. Darius settled into a seat, staring out the window, jaw tightening. He forced himself to let it go. But as other passengers filed in, he couldn't help noticing how Brad greeted them. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Andrews. Can I hang your coat for you?" "Hello there, Mrs. Carlson. Orange juice or champagne today?" "Mr. Kincaid. Always a pleasure, aisle or window this time." The difference was unmistakable. When Brad turned back to him, it was with clipped, grudging politeness, as though he was an inconvenience to be managed. 10 minutes later, Darius pressed the service button. Brad came back with a long-suffering sigh. "Yes." "I'd like a blanket, please," Darius said calmly. Brad's lips tightened. "We're short on blankets today. I'll see what I can do." He made no move to leave. Darius met his stare evenly. "If you can't, just say so." Brad rolled his eyes, then turned sharply. A moment later, he returned with a thin, scratchy blanket, which he dropped on Darius's tray with a dismissive flick of his wrist. "Try not to lose it." Darius picked it up deliberately and folded it over his lap without a word. Across the aisle, a man in a pastel golf shirt and khakis turned to his wife and whispered, loud enough for Darius to hear, "Always wanting something extra, huh?" Darius turned his head slowly. "Excuse me." The man smirked, looking away. Didn't say anything. Brad chuckled as he walked past. Darius felt the heat in his face, but inhaled deeply, reining in the impulse to snap. A few minutes later, Brad was standing near the galley with another flight attendant, Laura, a woman with a tight bun and too bright lipstick. She glanced at Darius and asked in a stage whisper, "Did you check him in already?" Brad snorted. "Yeah, twice. Gotta watch these types. Always trying to game the system." Laura laughed. "Of course." Darius heard every word. As boarding finished, Brad began moving down the aisle offering drinks. When he reached Darius, he hesitated, glancing down at his manifest. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass again before serving?" Darius held out the ticket in silence, rage roiling beneath his calm exterior. Across the cabin, another passenger caught Brad's eye and smirked. "Problem passenger?" Brad winked. "You know it." Darius squeezed the armrest until his knuckles whitened. He could hear the words echo in his head. "You're making others uncomfortable." He turned to face the window, biting back anything he might say. He knew the game too well. React, and you're the angry black man. Stay silent, and they think they've won. But it didn't stop. Laura walked down the aisle with a radio at her hip. Darius watched her discreetly press the button and mumble something into it. A moment later, Brad's radio crackled back. "Yeah, 2A, Laura said, eyes on him. "Possible code 74. Brad snorted. "Copy. I'll keep an eye." Darius blinked. Code 74? He didn't know airline slang, but the meaning was clear enough. A problem passenger. He could feel his pulse thumping in his neck. When meal service began, Brad offered options to everyone else with a grin. "Sirloin or salmon?" When he got to Darius, "We're out of salmon." "Sirloin, okay." Darius didn't even answer at first. Brad's smile flattened. "I'll take that as a yes." The cabin was full of murmurs and sidelong glances. Across the aisle, the man in the golf shirt shot him another glance, a satisfied little smirk on his face like he'd won something. Darius turned away, rolling his eyes. Brad came down the aisle again with the drink cart, moving slowly, chatting with the other passengers, refilling champagne flutes, and passing out snacks with a showy flourish. When he reached Darius, his entire demeanor changed. The grin slipped from his face, replaced by the same sour look he wore before. "Something to drink?" he asked flatly. Darius stared at him for a moment before answering in an even voice. "Sparkling water, please." Brad let out a long, performative sigh. "We're out of sparkling. You'll have to take still." Darius ground his molars together. "Fine." Brad filled a plastic cup and handed it to him without looking at him, already leaning toward the next passenger to turn on the charm. Darius watched him laugh with a couple in 2B and 2C, telling them about the airline's wine list, as if he hadn't just treated Darius like an unwelcome intruder. He took a careful sip of the water, placing the cup on his tray table with deliberate precision. He reminded himself again, don't give them the reaction they want. But his patience was thinning. After the drink service ended, the purser, a stocky man in his late 40s with a gleaming name badge that read Dan, strode purposefully toward Darius. Dan wore the expression of a man who liked being in charge. He stopped next to Darius's seat, leaning slightly so his voice carried to the entire first-class cabin. "Sir," he said loudly, drawing the attention of half the rows, "I'm going to ask you to stop harassing my crew." Darius blinked. He hadn't said a single word since asking for water. His eyebrows drew together. "Excuse me." Dan's eyes hardened and his voice rose even further. "We've had multiple reports that you're being disruptive and confrontational." Darius could feel the weight of dozens of eyes turning on him, necks craning to watch the show. He felt heat flush up his collar. "I haven't been disruptive," he said slowly, enunciating every word, willing his voice not to shake with rage. "I asked for a blanket and I asked for a drink. That's it." Dan snorted. "Sir, you need to calm down. You're making the other passengers uncomfortable." Darius exhaled in disbelief. "Making them uncomfortable? For what? Existing in my seat?" A woman 2 rows up muttered something about these people always playing the race card. Her husband nodded, pretending to shush her while wearing a smirk. Dan straightened, projecting authority. "Stop causing drama, sir. This is your last warning. If you can't behave, we'll have to escort you off at the next stop." Darius's heart pounded in his ears. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, realizing that even a single raised word would be used against him. His hands shook slightly as he pressed them flat against his knees. Across the aisle, the man in the golf shirt snorted. "Entitled prick," he stage whispered to his wife, who tittered behind her hand. Another passenger, a woman with carefully styled blonde hair, actually pulled out her phone and began recording, her lips twisted in gleeful anticipation. "Look at him," she hissed. "He's gonna blow up any second." Darius caught her eye and felt an electric rage that nearly buckled him. He forced himself to look away. Dan took another step closer, looming over him. "Do we understand each other?" Darius spoke carefully. "Yes, I understand." Dan gave a satisfied little nod, as if he'd won. "Good. Enjoy your flight." He turned and walked off, stopping 2 rows ahead to murmur something reassuring to the couple in 2B and 2C, who gave him supportive smiles. Brad, lurking near the galley, caught Dan's eye and gave him a smug thumbs up. Darius's chest rose and fell quickly. He fought the urge to stand up and shout the truth to the entire cabin. That he'd been polite, that he'd been calm, that they'd provoked him every step of the way. He glanced around. Eyes turned away quickly, feigning interest in phones, magazines, movies. No one wanted to see it. No one wanted to acknowledge it. The woman filming lowered her phone only when she was sure nothing more explosive was coming. She pouted in disappointment. Darius turned back to the window, the darkness outside offering no comfort. He felt the shame burn in him like acid. "They want you angry," he reminded himself. "They want the video. They want the meltdown." He refused to give it to them, but the injustice stuck in his throat like a jagged stone. He swallowed hard. He clenched and unclenched his fists until the cramps eased. Brad and Laura clustered near the galley with the purser Dan, who whispered to them with hushed urgency while they nodded in mock serious agreement. Darius leaned back in his seat with his eyes closed, reviewing every second of it, refusing to forget. He opened them again, locking his gaze on Brad, who quickly looked away, but not before smirking. Darius inhaled through his nose, held it, and exhaled slowly. He could feel the plane's vibration through his seat, the quiet luxury of first class, now an unbearable cage. He watched the curtain separating first class from economy billow slightly with every movement of the crew and felt the distance it represented in more ways than one. When the plane landed at its first stop, the purser made a special announcement in a falsely calm voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, for our passengers continuing on to Los Angeles, please remain seated while local authorities assist with the situation." The words cracked over the intercom like a slap. Heads turned toward Darius, suspicion thick in the air. The golf shirt man across the aisle shifted so he could watch Darius directly, waiting to see what would happen. The blonde woman with the phone perked up hopefully, tapping the screen to record. Darius didn't move. His jaw worked silently. He watched Dan speak to Brad and Laura with an air of smug authority before walking directly over. "Sir, you'll need to deplane," Dan said loudly enough for the whole cabin to hear. "There's been a report about your behavior, and we'll be sorting it out with local staff. Please cooperate." Darius forced himself to reply evenly. "I'd like to know what exactly I'm being accused of." Dan didn't blink. "Being disruptive. Making passengers and crew feel threatened. Our staff is trained to spot troublemakers, sir. Please don't make this harder." The words hit like a punch to the ribs. Trained to spot troublemakers. The phrase felt rehearsed, a neat corporate justification for removing people like him. Darius didn't stand immediately. He turned, scanning the cabin. Eyes snapped away, pretending not to see. He saw the golf shirt man's satisfied grin. He saw the woman recording lean forward. He saw Laura's smug expression as she whispered to Brad. He saw Brad's triumphant smirk. He stood slowly, gathering his carry-on. His movements were careful and deliberate, as if any sudden motion might be used as evidence of aggression. Dan didn't step aside. He loomed there, blocking the aisle until Darius had to maneuver around him. He felt the burn of dozens of eyes, the unspoken condemnation in every turned head. As he stepped out of first class into the narrow space before the door, the air felt stale and thick. He heard Laura behind him say under her breath, "Finally." He was making everyone so uncomfortable. Brad chuckled. His type always does. Always playing the race card. Darius stopped for half a second at that, spine straightening. He heard Dan's impatient exhale. "Sir, let's go." He stepped forward again without responding. Outside the plane, the jet bridge felt cold and cavernous. An airline manager stood waiting, a woman with iron gray hair and an expression of forced civility. She introduced herself with stiff professionalism, but her eyes were calculating. "Mr. Mitchell, I understand there's been an incident," she said, clipboard in hand, not even offering a handshake. Darius kept his voice level. "Your staff falsely accused me of being disruptive. I'd like to lodge a formal complaint." She didn't even glance at the form in her hand. "We take staff safety seriously, Mr. Mitchell. Our team is trained to handle these situations, and if they felt you were a threat, we stand by them." Darius felt his pulse surge. "You didn't even ask for my side." The manager's eyebrows lifted, and she let out a small huff, clearly annoyed at having to stand here. "Sir, I'm not here to debate. The decision was made. You'll wait here while we determine next steps." Darius closed his mouth, tasting blood where he'd bitten the inside of his cheek to stop himself from shouting. He stared at her until she shifted uncomfortably. "I want your name," he said finally, voice dangerously quiet. She sighed as if dealing with a child and rattled it off mechanically before writing something down. "We'll note your complaint," she added with a dismissive wave of her pen. He felt humiliation settle on his shoulders like a lead coat. Behind him, the door of the plane closed with a hiss, sealing the other passengers inside. He could imagine them relaxing now that the problem was removed. He could practically hear their sighs of relief, see the amused conversations picking apart his so-called meltdown. He heard muffled laughter behind the door from where Brad and Laura likely stood, imagining their cruel jokes. His type always plays the race card. The words repeated in his mind with vile clarity. He turned and set his bag down carefully by his feet. He looked out the small porthole window in the jet bridge, watching ground crew move with indifferent efficiency. He felt the cool metallic wall against his palm, grounding himself. The manager glanced at him occasionally, but said nothing else, tapping at her tablet like he wasn't there. Finally, she spoke up, sounding bored. "Security will be coming to escort you back into the terminal." The woman behind the counter wore the airline's navy blazer, her smile rigid and hollow. She didn't bother hiding her sigh when she saw him approach. "Mr. Mitchell, I understand there was an incident." Her tone made it clear she did not believe in the incident, just the inconvenience of dealing with it. Darius kept his voice low but firm. "I want a formal complaint filed immediately." She blinked, startled by the force in his words. She cleared her throat and glanced at her screen, typing slowly. "Of course, sir. I'll make a note." He watched the cursor blink on the empty field she hadn't even filled in yet. She refused to meet his eyes, tapping a few keys with the minimum effort possible. "Now," she said with false cheer, "let's get you rebooked. Unfortunately, first class is full on all remaining flights today." She didn't even bother pretending to check. Darius inhaled slowly, controlling the tremor in his hands. "I paid for a first-class ticket." She gave a brittle, unconvincing frown of sympathy. "I'm sorry, sir. It's policy to rebook in the next available seat. You'll be in economy. That's all I can do." He felt a white-hot spike of rage at the casual cruelty of it. He wanted to demand a supervisor, but he could see the uniformed security watching from a polite distance, waiting for him to act up. He knew exactly how that would play out, so he didn't. He nodded once, jaw locked. "Fine. Print it." She handed over the new boarding pass with robotic efficiency, refusing even to say sorry again. Darius took it without a word and turned away. He went through security again with his bag held tight, the agent looking at him a beat too long, as if he'd heard something. The whispers of disruptive and problem had spread ahead of him. He found his new gate and sat in the waiting area, his posture rigid, his bag on his lap like a shield. He checked his phone. He opened a new note and started typing. Every detail, every name, every insult, every phrase they used to humiliate him. He wrote with methodical precision, turning humiliation into evidence. When they finally boarded the replacement flight, they called zones and seats, leaving him for last even though he was listed as Group 2. The agent scanned his pass and barely looked at him. He took the middle seat in the back of the plane, knees jammed against the tray table, the smell of stale coffee and disinfectant mixing in the recycled air. No one spoke to him. They didn't have to. He felt it all in the sideways glances. When the plane landed hours later, well after midnight, he stumbled off exhausted, body aching from the cramped seat. He walked through the quiet terminal to the luggage claim. He watched the carousel grind to life, watched bags appear one by one. He waited and waited until the carousel ground to a halt with a metallic whine. His bag wasn't there. He felt something cold and ugly settle in his stomach. He went to the counter, forced himself to speak clearly. "My bag didn't arrive." The attendant, a young man with a plastic name tag that read Jordan, didn't even look sorry. He started typing slowly. Name. Darius spelled it. Jordan frowned at the screen. "Oh, says here it was loaded on the flight." Darius felt his voice go sharper. "Well, it's not here." Jordan shrugged. "Guess it's delayed. Happens." Darius pressed his lips together so hard they hurt. "What are you going to do?" Jordan barely sighed. "We'll track it. Fill this out." He pushed a battered clipboard over the counter. Darius filled in the details with fingers that shook. He handed it back. Jordan's expression didn't change. "We'll call you if it turns up." But the airline staff at the customer service desk smiled blankly, offered scripted apologies, and refused to escalate. A manager emerged after 10 minutes, her lips pressed thin as she read his file on the screen. She didn't even look at him when she said, "We're sorry you feel this way, sir." That phrase stuck in his head like a needle, the practiced corporate non-apology that shifted blame onto the offended. Darius stared at her in silence until she squirmed and gestured to the security officer posted nearby. He understood the message. He walked away slowly, eyes burning holes in the carpet. But he wasn't done. He took out his phone and began writing every name, every title, every time someone said policy instead of listening. Later, in the airport cafe, he sat nursing bitter coffee, ignoring the stares of travelers who still looked at him like he didn't belong. He scrolled news articles about discrimination suits filed against other airlines. He wrote drafts of a letter to corporate, to lawyers, to journalists. His mind buzzed with possibilities. It was there that a quiet voice broke through his spiral of planning. "Mr. Mitchell?" He looked up sharply. It was a flight attendant in uniform, a young black woman with careful braids pinned back neatly. She glanced around nervously before sitting across from him without waiting for permission. Her eyes were worried, but there was steel under the fear. "I don't have long," she said quickly. "They don't want us talking to you." Darius blinked. "They?" She glanced over her shoulder at the boarding gates. "Management. Crew leads. They're watching for us." He sat forward, lowering his voice. "Why? What do they think I'll do?" She swallowed. "They're afraid you'll tell people, that you'll go public, that you'll sue. They are preparing." He felt a tremor of ugly vindication. "So they know exactly what they did." She didn't answer, but her eyes were enough. Then she slid something across the table. A folded printout. "I can't be seen with this, but you need to see it." Darius took it with careful fingers and unfolded it slowly. It was a spreadsheet. He read the top line and felt his skin crawl. Customer compliance flag list. The columns were labeled things like watch level, behavior risk, verification required, and worst of all, profile notes. He scanned the rows and felt his gut twist. Dozens of names. Notes like African American male, question ticket, Hispanic female, aggressive tone, Arab sounding name, security, double check. He closed his eyes. "Jesus." She spoke quickly. "They flag passengers. They say it's for compliance, but everyone knows who ends up on it." He opened his eyes and met hers. "This is policy?" She shook her head. "Officially? No, but everyone knows. Supervisors hand it out in training. They tell us to use our judgment, but this is what they mean." Darius let out a breath that shook. He leaned back in the creaking hotel chair and cracked his neck. It was past 2 a.m., but he couldn't sleep even if he tried. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Brad's smirk, Laura's fake smile, Dan's smug authority, the airline manager refusing to hear a single word. He saw the ruined photos of his parents and his nieces and nephews. He felt the weight of his own silence as they called him disruptive. He remembered the way the passengers had watched him get escorted out, relief and satisfaction on their faces, the man in the golf shirt muttering entitled prick, the woman filming, waiting for the meltdown she could post online to prove he was a problem. But there hadn't been a meltdown. He had stayed calm. He had played their game, and they had still humiliated him. Now, he was going to play his own game. He opened his email client and began sending the document to journalists, activists, legal aid clinics. Each email tailored but direct. He included dates, times, flight numbers, employee names, quotes, and the scanned evidence of the list. He made sure it was undeniable. He hit send and closed the laptop with a decisive snap. The next morning, he put on the last clean shirt he had and returned to the airport customer service desk. He walked up to the woman behind the counter and set his ID on the counter like a badge. "I need to speak to your manager." Now, she barely suppressed an eye roll. "About what, sir?" He didn't let the sarcasm slide. "About the incident on my flight, about my property damage, about your staff's conduct, and about the complaint I filed that no one responded to." She typed slowly, deliberately. "I see you filed a complaint. It says here it's resolved." He felt something snap inside him. Resolved? I was kicked off a flight I paid for. I was labeled a security threat without cause. My luggage was destroyed and searched. I have photographic evidence of damage. Your staff used racial slurs and coded language. I was threatened with police. I want to know how that's resolved." She blinked, unfazed. "It says here you accepted a voucher. That closes the case." He laughed, the sound dry and bitter. "A $50 voucher? That's your idea of justice." She shrugged. "That's our policy." He leaned in closer, voice low and dangerous. "You know it's not over. I sent everything to the press. I sent it to lawyers. You can't bury this." She looked annoyed now. "Sir, if you keep raising your voice, I'll have to call security." He exhaled slowly, straightening up, remembering the game. He forced his voice calm. "Do it. I want them to see this." She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable now. She picked up the phone and made a show of dialing, but no one came. He stood there watching her squirm until finally she hung up. "You'll hear from us," she snapped, but her voice cracked. He turned and left without another word. Back at the hotel, he called the airline's complaint hotline again. After navigating 10 layers of automated menus, he reached a human who listened politely and then read the same scripted lines. "I see your case has been resolved. Unfortunately, we can't reopen it. Have a good day." He hung up so hard he nearly cracked the screen. He called a lawyer next, someone he'd worked with before. The man answered with relief in his voice. "Darius, I got your email. I'm going to help you. This is big." They talked for over an hour. The lawyer promised he'd start drafting letters immediately, would subpoena the airline's internal records, would make them answer for every single act. For the first time in days, Darius felt something like hope. He slept that night for 4 hours straight without waking up in a cold sweat. He sent emails to journalists, lawyers, civil rights groups, and when some ignored him or politely declined, he resent them with all the evidence attached in bold red. He spent hours on the phone with reporters, answering the same questions over and over until his voice went raw. He watched as word spread, first as cautious mentions on social media, then as viral tweets with screenshots of the compliance list, then as outraged headlines on news sites. Airline accused of profiling black passengers. Internal compliance list revealed. Passenger says airline searched and destroyed his belongings. He watched the airline scramble with canned statements about isolated incidents and training improvements. He laughed when he saw them claim to be shocked and saddened. He wasn't surprised. He'd spent enough time reading their internal memos. Because while they called him a troublemaker, while they threatened his lawyers and refused his calls, they didn't know who he really was. They didn't know the quiet moves he'd made over the last decade. They thought he was just another black man they could throw off a plane and forget. But they were wrong. Very wrong. Darius stood at the mirror in his hotel bathroom, adjusting his tie, staring at the lines under his eyes. He'd barely slept, but today he needed to look like exactly what he was, in control. He practiced saying the words once, twice, 3 times, until they felt like part of him. Then he picked up his briefcase, packed with documents and receipts and damning memos, and walked out of the room without looking back. He didn't take the airline's shuttle to the press conference. He ordered a black car, the driver opening the door with careful deference. As they drove, Darius rehearsed silently, fingers tapping against the leather seat in an anxious rhythm. The city blurred past in muted grays and greens. His phone buzzed constantly with journalists asking for quotes, activists cheering him on, strangers telling him their own stories of being singled out, demeaned, ignored. He read them all. He replied when he could. When the car pulled up to the conference center, he stepped out into a wall of flashes. Reporters crowded behind barriers, shouting questions. He ignored them for now. He would answer soon, but on his terms. He walked through the glass doors and straight to the podium they'd set up in front of a navy blue backdrop. He adjusted the microphone. He could see the airline's lawyers in the back row, whispering furiously to each other. He gave them a small smile. Then he began to speak. His voice was calm, measured, unflinching. Good morning. My name is Darius Mitchell. Some of you may know me as the passenger forcibly removed from Flight 347 under the pretense of security. Some of you may have seen the footage of me being told to stop causing drama for asking for a blanket, or watch the airline dismiss my formal complaint as resolved with a $50 voucher. Today, I want to clarify exactly who I am and what this airline has done. He paused. The room held its breath. Then he dropped the first bombshell. What you don't know is that I am also the majority shareholder in the airline's parent company. Gasps rippled through the crowd. He let it settle before continuing. Over the last 8 years, I quietly acquired controlling interest through a series of private equity groups and shell corporations. Not because I wanted a headline, but because I believed in the potential of this company to change. I served on the board's Diversity and Inclusion Council, drafting the very policies this airline claims to value. He held up a stack of papers. These are internal memos from that council, memos with my name on them recommending concrete anti-profiling measures, training standards, accountability reviews. Memos that were erased from the record when they became inconvenient. He flipped the top page to show his signature next to bullet points on mandatory bias training, whistleblower protections, transparent complaint handling. I was told these would be implemented. I was told the company valued diversity, our operational culture. In plain English, they don't want people like me calling out their bias. They wouldn't have. He had spent years setting it up, playing the quiet investor, letting them think he was satisfied with polite words and boardroom platitudes. He leaned back toward the mic, voice level, each word chosen like a scalpel. I want to be clear, he said, his voice carrying even to the back rows. This is not a negotiation. This is a reckoning. Effective immediately, as a controlling shareholder, I am authorizing an independent investigation into every single discrimination complaint filed against this airline in the last 10 years. The room rippled with noise, but he continued without pause. This investigation will have subpoena power. It will have full access to all internal records, and it will be public. Every report, every conclusion, every apology owed will be delivered publicly, because secrecy is how rot survives. He turned slightly, eyes flicking to the cameras streaming live on networks and social media feeds. He knew millions were watching now. Furthermore, I am suspending the chief executive officer and the entire executive team pending this investigation. Gasps broke out across the room. One reporter actually dropped her phone. The airline's legal counsel shot up from his seat, shouting, "You can't do this." Darius didn't even glance at him. He continued in the same calm tone. They will be replaced with interim leadership drawn from outside the company to ensure impartiality and to guarantee the investigation proceeds without interference. This company failed its customers. It failed its employees. And it failed me. It doesn't get to hide behind excuses anymore. He flipped through his notes and produced another sheet of paper, holding it up for the cameras to catch. Here is the directive I just signed. It removes the CEO effective immediately and authorizes interim oversight by a committee I will personally appoint. They will include civil rights advocates, consumer protection lawyers, and members of the communities most often targeted by profiling. He let that sink in. Reporters jostled, shouting questions. He held up a hand again. I know you all have questions. I'll take them. But first, there's something I need to do. He set the paper down, exhaled once, and looked straight into the camera lens. I want to speak to the employees watching this, to the staff who tried to stop this, who reported the discrimination, who got silenced, threatened, fired, or ignored. I see you, and I want to say this plainly. Thank you. He paused, letting the words hang. This change is not because of me. It's because of you. Because you refused to stay silent. Because you handed over proof even when you knew it could cost you your job. Because you gave me the evidence to show the world what this company truly is. He took a deep breath. He thought of the young black flight attendant with the braids pinned neatly who had slipped him the compliance list, eyes darting around in fear, voice trembling but determined. He thought of the other employees who had quietly emailed him after the story broke, sending copies of internal complaints that went unanswered, screenshots of racist jokes in private Slack channels, recordings of managers telling them to watch certain types. Today, he continued, voice tightening with emotion he didn't bother to hide, I am offering positions in this new oversight committee to those whistleblowers. Not just token roles, senior positions, decision-making power, the authority to shape the policies they know need to change, because they have seen the truth up close, and they will make sure this can never happen again. Another murmur surged through the room. Reporters began frantically rewriting their leads. A couple of them wiped at their eyes. The lawyer who had tried to shout him down slumped back into his chair, defeated. Darius let out a slow breath, feeling the weight begin to shift, just slightly. For the first time in days, the tight coil of rage in his chest loosened. Not gone, never gone, but transformed into something sharp and useful. He straightened. I know some of you will ask, why now? Why did I stay silent for so long? He let that question hang, let the camera zoom in on his face. Because I thought polite words would fix this. Because I thought boardroom meetings and DI councils and corporate slogans would mean something. I was wrong. They used my presence as a shield while doing nothing to change. They smiled in my face while deleting my memos and ignoring every recommendation. I let them. That ends today. He turned a page in his notes and read a short paragraph, his voice flat. This company will settle all existing discrimination complaints at full requested damages. As he settled into the back seat of the car, he pulled out his phone and watched as notifications flooded in. News sites were already running headlines with phrases like shareholder coup, mass firing at airline, and whistleblowers offered senior roles. He saw video clips of himself at the podium, eyes fierce, voice even and deadly. He watched himself hold up the compliance list for the world to see. He felt no joy in it, only grim satisfaction. He knew it wasn't over. It was just starting. He called the lawyer who had first agreed to help him before the airline threatened him into silence. The man answered breathlessly. I saw the press conference. Darius, you didn't just make a splash. You set the ocean on fire. Darius didn't laugh. He didn't even smile. I want you back on this, he said quietly. Full throttle. File everything we can. I want discovery, depositions, subpoenas. I want it public. The lawyer paused. Then he said, voice steady, it would be an honor. Darius hung up and let his head rest against the window as the city blurred past. He thought about the whistleblower, the fear in her eyes as she'd passed him the paper. He thought about the employees who had sent him screenshots of management chats mocking customers of color, the HR memo telling them to avoid diversity hires, the managers who had signed off on the compliance list with polite signatures. He would not forget them. He would not forgive them. The next day, the fallout began in earnest. He woke to the news that the airline stock had dropped by 30% overnight, a historic collapse that had analysts describing it as a bloodbath. On his tablet, he watched financial networks with their panels of experts dissecting the implosion in real time. One pointed to the graph of the stock price and said grimly, "This is catastrophic. They've lost over $3 billion in market capitalization in a single trading day." Another said, Government contracts are being suspended pending investigation. Major corporate clients are canceling their travel deals. This is an existential threat to the airline. Darius didn't celebrate. He didn't gloat. He just sat at the small hotel desk, reading every headline with the same careful attention he had given the compliance list. He wanted to see it. He wanted to remember. He switched apps and saw social media exploding with hashtags calling for boycotts. Former passengers shared their own stories of discrimination. Video clips surfaced of flight attendants using racial slurs in private, of managers bragging about removing problem passengers, of Brad's sneer as he said, "Try not to lose it," tossing the blanket onto Darius's tray. Someone had been filming it all along and posted it with a simple caption. This is what he meant. Darius watched it once, jaw locked. He didn't share it. He didn't need to. It was already everywhere. The airline scrambled to respond. They held their own press conference. The interim CEO, a grim, tight-faced lawyer flown in overnight, stood behind the same blue podium Darius had used, but without the authority. He stammered through apologies. He promised sweeping changes. He accepted full responsibility. But no one bought it. Reporters grilled him about the compliance list, the HR memo, the threatened lawyers. He offered rehearsed lines and stumbled when pressed. Shares continued to fall. Lawsuits poured in. Class action filings from passengers who had been removed or harassed. Wrongful termination suits from whistleblower employees who had been fired for speaking up. Civil rights groups joined in, offering legal aid and resources to anyone with a claim. The Department of Transportation announced it was opening an inquiry. The Justice Department hinted at civil rights violations. Darius watched every announcement on TV, silent. He watched interviews with other black travelers describing being singled out for random checks, being told to move to economy, being threatened with security for asking for service. The story spilled out, unstoppable now, a tidal wave of buried pain. And then came the video that changed everything. A local news team caught the airline manager who had ordered Darius off the plane, still wearing his company-issued blazer, ID badge crooked, expression pinched with worry, being led away in handcuffs by local law enforcement. The charge? Obstruction, harassment, falsifying security reports. The camera zoomed in on his face as he tried to turn away. Reporters shouting questions about the compliance list, about Darius Mitchell, about racial profiling. He didn't answer. He just kept his head down. Darius watched the footage on repeat. He didn't feel satisfaction, so much as grim justice. It wasn't revenge. It was consequence. It was the price of arrogance. The next clip showed Laura and Brad, the flight attendants who had mocked him and called him Code 74, exiting the airline's headquarters with boxes of their belongings, ignoring cameras as journalists called their names. Did you know about the list? Do you want to apologize to Darius Mitchell? How many passengers did you label as threats? They didn't answer. They didn't look up. Darius muted the sound and watched them walk to their cars. He thought about the compliance list, the neat rows of names and ethnicities and risk levels. He thought about the HR memo that treated diversity like a liability. He thought about every passenger who had sat silently, watching him get removed, telling themselves it wasn't their problem. He unmuted the TV as a legal analyst spoke over stock footage of the company's gleaming headquarters. The airline's exposure is massive. Beyond the class actions, they face federal fines, contract suspensions, permanent damage to their reputation. This is a textbook example of systemic failure and arrogance. Darius sat alone in his new office, high above the city skyline in the headquarters of the airline he now effectively controlled, the afternoon sun throwing long stripes of light across the polished floor. He leaned back in the chair, fingers steepled under his chin, eyes closed as he tried to process the last few months that had upended his life and forced an entire industry to look at itself in the mirror. He thought about that first humiliating moment on the plane when Brad tossed the blanket on his tray with mock politeness, the smirk that told Darius exactly what the man thought of him, and how Laura had whispered his type, as if he were an object instead of a human being with a family and a history and dignity. He thought about Dan standing over him in the aisle, warning him to stop causing drama in front of an entire first-class cabin, making sure he felt the power dynamic so deeply that even asking for basic service was treated as aggression. He remembered the shame, the humiliation of being forced off the plane under the eyes of strangers who judged him without knowing a single thing about him except the color of his skin. He remembered standing on the jet bridge while airline staff laughed behind a closed door, while the manager read a scripted non-apology about policy that somehow blamed him for making people uncomfortable. And he remembered the rage, white-hot and clarifying, as he pieced together every insult, every demeaning glance, every act of institutional arrogance, documenting it meticulously until he had built a fortress of evidence that no one could deny. He opened his eyes and exhaled slowly, glancing at the framed compliance list on his desk, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of what he destroyed. He kept it there deliberately, highlighting the coded phrases like watch level, high for black passengers, the quiet bureaucratic racism that was more dangerous than open slurs because it pretended to be policy, pretending to be safety while punishing people for existing. The fallout had been brutal and public. The airline had lost billions. Executives had been fired or resigned in disgrace. Whistleblowers who had been silenced and threatened had been rehired with full back pay and placed in oversight positions with real authority. Civil rights groups had been invited to audit the company annually and publish their findings with full transparency. The old guard who had mocked Darius as a problem passenger was gone, replaced by people who had the scars and experience to know exactly why reform was needed. And yet the most surprising part for Darius hadn't been the firings or the financial collapse. It had been the personal reckonings. He thought about Laura, the flight attendant who had mocked him to Brad and snickered about his type, now standing on camera, voice cracking with tears, saying she was sorry. Not with corporate-approved phrasing, but with real, raw regret. "I never questioned it," she'd said, eyes red. "I just did what they taught me. I wanted to be good at my job. And I hurt people. I hurt you. I'll never forgive myself for that." He remembered how he'd listened without interrupting, arms folded, the silence heavy but necessary. She hadn't asked for forgiveness. She hadn't tried to justify it. She just admitted it publicly. He respected that more than any scripted apology. Then there was Brad, who had been so smug and cruel, who had loved the petty power of enforcing the rules selectively. Brad, who had laughed at Darius's anger, who had rolled his eyes and pretended Darius was crazy for wanting what every other first-class passenger got automatically. Brad had shown up to their meeting erect, hair unkempt, eyes haunted, voice cracking as he admitted, "I liked it. I liked feeling in control. I liked watching you squirm. I thought it was funny, and I hate myself for it now." He hadn't asked for forgiveness either, just the chance to say it out loud. Darius hadn't given him comfort, but he hadn't thrown him out. He'd let him speak. He'd listened. He'd watched Brad sign up for anti-bias training not because it was a PR stunt, but because he had nowhere else to go, because he realized he would never be employable in that industry again if he didn't truly change. He thought about Dan, the purser who had humiliated him most of all, who had towered over him on the plane, shouting about threats and causing drama, while the whole cabin watched. Dan, who had resisted at first, red-faced and angry, screaming about how Darius had ruined his life before collapsing into ugly sobs, admitting he liked the power, that he'd been taught to use it without question. Dan, who had confessed, voice shaking, "I never saw you as a person, just as a problem. I didn't even think about it." Darius had stared at him for a long time before speaking, voice calm and merciless. "Then do better. Use this shame. Teach someone else not to make your mistake." Dan had listened. Dan had surprised everyone when, after weeks of silence, he'd applied for the airline's new chief of anti-bias education role. The interim CEO had balked, afraid of the optics. But Darius had overruled them. He'd insisted on the hire, because he didn't want a polished corporate trainer with a marketing degree teaching the next generation of staff. He wanted the man who had been the problem, who had made every mistake, who had destroyed lives with a smile, to stand at the front of a room and admit it, to show them the cost of complicity. Dan had accepted. On live television, his hands shook as he read the statement Darius had insisted he write himself. "I humiliated passengers of color because I thought I could, because I was taught they were threats, because it made me feel powerful. I'm ashamed. I'm sorry. I can't undo it. But I'll spend the rest of my career making sure no one else in this company does what I did." Reporters had asked if Darius was trying to humiliate him. Darius had replied evenly, "No, I'm trying to save him and us." He knew some people thought it was too generous. That Dan didn't deserve redemption. That Brad and Laura should be banned forever from customer service jobs. He didn't argue. He understood that anger. He felt it too. But he also knew that punishing individuals without changing the system was pointless. It would just replace them with new faces who made the same choices. He didn't want vengeance. He wanted transformation, even if it was messy, even if it was hard, even if it demanded forgiveness he wasn't sure he could give. He knew change wasn't a press conference or a payout. It was 1,000 small decisions every day. It was hiring the right people and listening to them. It was writing policy that didn't allow for discretion that turned into discrimination. It was watching and auditing and firing those who wouldn't change. It was giving people who wanted to change the tools to do it. It was telling the truth every single time, even when it hurt. Especially when it hurt. Darius took one last look at the compliance list on his desk before standing and buttoning his jacket. He picked up his briefcase and headed for the door. Outside, a new team waited. Lawyers, HR specialists, diversity consultants, former whistleblowers, now in positions of power. Dan stood there too, holding a stack of training materials, eyes meeting Darius's with an uneasy mix of shame and determination. Darius gave him the barest nod. Dan straightened his shoulders and nodded back. No words, just understanding. They all filed into the conference room together. No press, no cameras, just work. Real work, the kind that lasts, the kind that mattered the end. If you've read this far, thank you for joining the journey. I'd love to know what you think about the story. Was the ending satisfying? Did the characters' transformations feel real? Which moment hit you the hardest? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every one. Also, let me know where you're reading from. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel and connect with people around the world. If you want more stories like this, full of tension, transformation, and meaningful messages, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. There's so much more to tell, and I'd love for you to be part of it.